Morning, I want to tell you two stories, and then I'm going to leave you with a few questions. The first story, you'll have no idea where I'm going with it, but if you bear with me, I think it will understand how it ties into the second story. The first story occurred when I was managing a hospital. One of the physicians on our staff was a Dr. Freeze, who was a pediatrician. His wife was a biochemist. And the two of them together were the world's leading authorities in chocolate allergies. So he had for me, it was a very unusual practice. People would come from all over the world that suffered with chocolate allergies. I don't know why you just don't avoid chocolate, but... And he came to see me and asked if I would be kind enough to invite my wife to go with he and his wife for a night of magic. And it turns out that his hobby was magic. And he did it with all of the children as a practicing pediatrician. He was also president of the National Association for Magicians. And every year they have a big convention, and they hold the convention at the town of the president. And this year he was president, and the convention was being held in New York City. They meet for a week, and then the last night is this big magic show. So Ginny and I went to this night of magic. And each act was a different magician. It wasn't one magician doing a lot of things. Each act was a separate person. And some had their magic boxes, and they cut people in half. And some had the magic wands that they would wave and do different things. Magic hats with people popping things coming out of the hat and disappearing in the hat. Everything you've ever seen in magic, they had that night. It was wonderful. There was all type of applause and all kinds of bravos, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful, exciting night that both Ginny and I enjoyed heartily, and we were most grateful to Dr. and Mrs. Freeze. But the best part of the evening was afterwards. They invited, I think the way the association was divided, each state had a representative that sat on their council. So they had a separate, at a restaurant, they had a private room set up for coffee and dessert afterwards. And Ginny and I were invited to that. And there was, say, about 50 people. But of those 50 people, there were only 2 who were non-magicians. And that was Ginny and I. So as a result of that, everyone came to our table and wanted to show us their latest trick. And I had no idea. Magicians carry all kinds of stuff with them. You know, card tricks and all that kind of stuff. Well, in this place, there was no applause. There was just Ginny and I. But the most noise probably came from us, and I would say, do that again. Do that again. I wanted to see it again because I knew they were tricking me, but I didn't know how they did it. And they'd do it again, and they'd still trick me again. It was just a wonderful, wonderful time. That's one story. We'll leave that over here. Hope you can visualize that night and those tricks and everything that goes with it. Another story is about a wedding. Now, you've all been to weddings. And a wedding in our country is a one-day event. In New Testament time, in the land of Israel, a wedding was an entirely different deal. It's broken into, basically, there are subcategories, but basically, 3 separate categories. There is the contract, the consummation, and the celebration. 3 entirely separate things. the contract comes first. And in those days, one didn't necessarily date and look for a husband or look for a wife. The way that it generally worked was the father would think that it was time for his son to have a wife. He wanted a good wife for his son, and so he would send not his son, but one of his most trusted servants. The trusted servants would go out the land searching for the ideal wife for the son. When he found that young woman, could be of any particular age, he would negotiate a contract for her. That could be an X number of dollars, it could be an X number of animals, it could be in jewels, it could be in a variety of things. But a contract was negotiated. Once that contract was finalized, then that young lady was considered married to this young man, even though they have never met. It was a binding contract. The time between when this contract was agreed to and when these two people met, maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, no one knew. That was all determined by the fellow's father. A little different from today, right? One of the things I don't want to get into now in terms of further detail, but there was always a question to the young man. And the question people would ask the young man is, when's the big day? And the answer was always the same no matter which young man you asked. And the answer was always, no one knows the time or the season. Only my Father knows. You've heard those words before? No one knows the time or the season. Only my Father knows. So there's this big gap of time. Eventually, the Father would decide, now's the time. So they would do two things when they said now's the time. One, they would call for the young lady to come to the new home. And part of this contract arrangement was every person in the household, particularly in farming community, has a function. And if that person isn't going to be there anymore, there's a value to that. And that's part of the compensation. Part of this time gap was for the father to be able to pay off whatever else was owed and to prepare a place for the bride. Sometimes that was in the parents' home. If they had more money, they built another home nearby. And then they would bring the bride and they would invite the guest. For a real small town, most of the guests were all the neighbors. As the town was larger, there would be selected neighbors and family and friends. And they would all come for the celebration. The celebration was never a one-day event. The celebration was at least a week. So the people would all come to the home. They would stay at neighbors' homes. Some would stay there. And in this place, they would all gather and they would eat and drink and dance and play for a week. They'd go back at night. That was the picture. So I want you to all visualize. You are at this wedding. The women are sitting there yakking about whatever women yak about. The men are over here talking about whatever men talk about. The kids are playing. As it gets later in the evening, everybody's drinking wine and dancing and having a good old jolly time. Got the picture? You're all out there doing that. Some of the people that are at the wedding are, let me divide this group up. Let me take these men and divide them. Jeff, slide over a wee bit this way, and you guys slide over a wee bit this way. Those guys over there are the servants. The guys over here are the disciples. And Bob over here on the end, even though he's got a little beard and stuff, he's 12 years old. That's important. He's 12. You with me so far? Okay, rest of the story. It's found in John chapter 2. Now it's on the third day. Remember I told you a wedding lasts at least a week? This is on the third day. So for 3 days now, you have been eating and dancing and playing and drinking. And some of you are gathered under the tree over there. You had too much to drink, so you're sleeping it off. You're all doing your thing here. And it's on the third day when the wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. And Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. And they ran out of wine. So Jesus' mother goes to Jesus and says, they have no more wine. Now, I don't know what Jesus' mother's role is in this wedding. Scholars think it's her sister's the one that's having the wedding. But she says there's no more wine. And Jesus says, and this is a term of affection. King James, if you're reading that, it just says woman. And I want to tell you, if I ever called my mother woman, my father would be down my throat in a minute. I was telling her, he never referred to my mother as my mother. He referred to her as my wife. And once when I mouthed off, he made it clear, you will never speak to my wife that way again. So I mention that because mother, dear woman, is a term of affection. It's not a rude son. Dear woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come. Which also means this time is coming, but it's not yet. His mother doesn't take that for a no. She turns to the servants over there and says, whatever he tells you, I want you to do it. And you say, yes, ma'am. So nearby, in the back room, there are 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each one holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Then Jesus says to the servants, Go fill those jars with water. So they did. They filled them all the way up to the brim. And then he said to them, now draw out some and take it to the master of the wedding. So they do. And they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. And he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who drew the water, they knew. And they called the bridegroom aside, and they said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. Did you all see this miracle? Would I be far off if I said you're all clueless? You didn't have the slightest idea. But you knew. And you knew. But you didn't. This is the first of the miraculous signs that Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. And thus he revealed his glory. And the disciples put their faith in him. I hate being clueless. But I do have a question for you. If you were at the wedding, you participated, and you drank of this extra good wine, and you had no idea where it came from, you're not going to be able to answer this for me, and it's not a question for me, but it's for you. In the life that you have lived so far, has there ever been a time where something good has happened and you said to yourself, wow, why did that smile on me? And you had no idea where it came from? And you who are servants, other than scratching your head and looking at each other and saying to yourself, what just happened? What do you do with that information? And for you disciples that have just started following Jesus, who knew of his words and his power, but you had no idea of this, and you witnessed this, what does that do to you? Does that change your life? And this 12-year-old on the end, this disciple who's not even a teenager yet, he now becomes an old man. And he's the one that's telling the story. And that's just one of the stories that you have carried with you since the age of 12. Why do I tell you that? And why did I tell you the first one? I told you the first one because I have a tendency to look at the miracles of the Lord as something magical, as something show-offy, as something, look at me, as something that receives applause, that's something that's done with magic words, that's something that's done with a magic cape or magic hat or magic wand or something where people are gathered together and they all watch it and they all applaud. The reality is, it's done so quietly, so simply, so smoothly, that you may not even see it. And if you're there and you do see it, there's never a, do it again. There's never a, wow. There's this quiet. What just happened? And you become hooked. And you want to know more. And so they follow him a little bit further. And they're more hooked than they were before, so they go a little bit further. And that's the way that it works. And all I want to do this morning is to lay the foundation so that as we go through the Gospel of John, which I will do for the rest of the year, is that you can become aware of the subtleties and the quiet smoothness in the way that it all works so that we can better understand. I skipped chapter 1 and went to chapter 2 because today is Worldwide Communion, and I figured it would be more fitting. And before we make that transition, I wanted to leave you with a little bit of trivia. Anybody like trivia? I have a new friend who had some students do the math on the wine. They took the number of gallons, figured out how many bottles of wine you could get out of those gallons, and then tried to put a price on a bottle of wine. Now, I don't know what everybody described this. This is really good wine. I don't know what kind of price you would put on it. It's not Ripple. If they still have Ripple and Thunderbird, I think were the two. This is good wine. And they calculated that if it was $30 a bottle, for those of you who are in the wine business, and my friend the chef back here, $30 a bottle. This is $28,000 worth of wine. Now, you all wanted to know that, right? That's a little trivia for you. But I hope in all this discussion of the thing that you can visualize how the Lord works in the quiet way that he goes about his business. Amen. If you'd be kind enough now to turn with me